It took some patience, but we are finally here. On May 14th, I took some time off from work, told my wife what was up, caught up with all of my chores, spent some quality time with the family, and then around 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, I booted up the game. I was up playing until 12:30 or so, which is by no means a usual thing for me to do these days. I'm going to save you guys some time. If you enjoyed mastering the combat in any Doom game, as well as Sekiro, just go play the Dark Ages. You can come watch the video and thank me later. If, however, you are not in this gamer niche, stick around and I'll do my best to tell you why I love the latest Doom, and also talk about where there might be room for improvement. We've all known for a long time that this latest entry would introduce some fundamental changes to the formula, and the most immediately noticeable one is the movement of the Slayer himself. For starters, your forward movement is a lot faster, assuming you enabled auto sprint, which I think you should. It also has more momentum and can enable you to jump much higher and farther. Your footsteps produce a heavy thud, and when you land from a height, the ground shakes beneath you as if struck by a comet. Further contributing to this sense of weight and presence is a much more advanced physics system. Banners ripple, statues collapse, and debris flies everywhere if you so much as graze past it. It feels awesome, and I will say Scalebearer players from Quake Champions will feel right at home in the Dark Ages. On the other hand, I found some of these effects to be excessive and potentially tiresome in the long run. For example, I quickly disabled the effects on the edge of the screen that trigger when you start sprinting. I also just turned off things like motion blur and screen shake and even weapon bob, as for me at least, these things don't help with the long-term enjoyment and mastery of the game. From a gameplay perspective, these changes to the movement are deeply impactful, no pun intended. They incentivize a more aggressive playstyle that also requires you to commit to your actions. Gone are the double dash, double jump, and monkey bars that allowed you to instantly and frequently reposition. In their place, we have the shield charge, and while it does cover a long distance, it also has a cooldown and comes with risks. Shield dashing does not make you immune to damage and requires a target. Choosing the wrong target at the wrong time can get you punished pretty harshly. Your basic strafes and backtracking are enough to avoid some projectiles, but others home in on you to a degree, so you often have to be precise with the timing and spacing of your movement. And since you can only run and leap forward, it's generally better to either stand your ground or push forward. I know there have been some concerns about the game looking slow, but in my experience it simply feels awesome in a different way. If in Eternal you were a hornet zipping around the battlefield, darting in and out of danger, here in the Dark Ages you are a heavy boulder rolling through the enemy ranks, doing your best to maximize the impact of your forward momentum. It's not something you can appreciate just by watching footage of the game, and I understand why some people think it looks slow. Trust me, it's something you need to experience yourself by controlling the game and learning to read and adapt to its unique flow. The fun zone of Doom Eternal is still very much here, but the path to it is mechanically different. And since I've already mentioned the shield, let's go over its many uses. In short, it can block, parry, be thrown for damage and stun, and dash to a target. But in my opinion, the coolest thing about the shield is how valuable of a resource it is in combat. I don't just mean it's generally useful and awesome, although it is that. What I mean is, if you commit to using your shield in one way, it leaves you temporarily unable to use it for other purposes. It's on you, the player, to make the best trade-offs. For example, the shield can be held up to block a limited amount of damage before needing to recover. This simple addition has made hitscan enemies a more interesting piece to play around on the battlefield. When moving between cover points, you can raise your shield to prevent damage or help close the distance. However, this means you cannot perform a parry, dash, or stun. Whether it's worth eating hitscan bullets to stun or parry a target in front of you is very situational. It might depend on how much more of a threat the second target is. It might be worth seeing how close you are to cover. Are you close enough to shield dash the hit scanner? What about other targets? Can you recover from the damage with offensive play? These are some of the questions you will eventually start discerning the answers to, all while bobbing and weaving between a variety of projectile patterns, focusing on your parry timings, weapon selection, and so on. This is one of the many ways the Dark Ages creates that level of engagement and fun that the more recent Doom games have become known and loved for. Speaking of parrying, I think the default parry window on Ultraviolence is very generous, but given the high number of enemies attacking you at once, I'd say that's probably balanced. Also, certain enemies do have trickier timings with feints, combos, and delayed attacks, all trying to throw you off in a manner that's very reminiscent of certain Souls games. Part of your skill progression as a player is becoming familiar with these patterns and timing for projectiles and melee attacks. It's a simple mechanic, but one with many implications for the rest of the game. Parrying opens enemies up for massive counter damage, especially in melee range. It allows you to maintain positioning, it can destroy enemy shields, and many other effects depending on your gear and upgrades. Shield charging at enemies covers a long distance and does a good amount of AoE damage, but I find is generally not advisable against healthier targets as they quickly retaliate before you can dispatch them. However, later in the game, the shield charge can be empowered when included in certain combos, and it ultimately is also a very situational tool. I've used it mostly to farm fodder groups for resources or reposition when needed. Lastly, we have the shield throw, which by itself has competing uses. It cuts clean through multiple fodder enemies, but it can also destroy overheated shields or armor, exposing enemies to damage. It can also embed itself into exposed enemies, stunning them and proccing a variety of additional effects depending on your upgrades. Then there are the environmental uses of the shield, opening new traversal options and allowing you to solve certain puzzles. And you know what's great about the shield? You do all of these things by pressing 1 or 2 buttons. In fact, this quality of simplicity with depth extends to the melee weapons as well, with only one attack button allowing you to execute combos, proc special effects, do glory strikes, and even chain attacks on multiple enemies depending on the state of said enemies, your timing and positioning, the sequence in which you combine other abilities, your build synergies, and so on. There are a total of 3 weapons, and I won't go too deep into spoilers, but they each have an upgrade path providing different utilities in combat. The parries and melee attacks go hand in hand. They're very much a part of taking down larger, more aggressive enemies. You have to understand the combo potential of your build and figure out what tool in your kit deals with what enemy in the most effective way. For example, I went from treating vagaries as extended boss fights at the beginning of my playthrough to basically taking them down in a matter of seconds once I understood which attacks to chain together and how. I do find myself wishing we had an option to disable the slow-mo that triggers on parries and melee attacks. Of course, I'd be lying if I said I didn't take advantage of the brief pause to make better decisions in a tight spot, but I do think eventually the slowdowns will get tiring and people will want to play the game without them. It is frankly a bit confusing why this option isn't in the game, since the sliders already allow you a very granular level of customizing the difficulty. You can boost both projectile and overall game speed, you can make the parry window much smaller, you can adjust the damage taken and inflicted, and so on. I know at least one person who wrote a negative review on Steam simply because they got fed up with the slow-mo, and I also saw a mod to disable this feature on YouTube just the day after the full release. Honestly, I think there's no reason not to have this in-game, even if it comes with a warning that it's only for more advanced players or something. And of course, at the center of your toolkit are still the guns with their distinct strengths and weaknesses. This is still a Doom game after all, and the Dark Ages offers a more unique selection of weapons in both visual design and gameplay impact. It's an arsenal that I loved from the beginning and has only grown on me since. It is hard to pick a personal favorite, but I think I might be in love with the Chain Shot and Impaler. The Chain Shot is basically a ranged melee weapon that allows you to smack enemies in the face with a heavy ball of iron, doing massive stagger and armor damage at full charge. Normally you need to hold attack to fully charge this weapon, but one upgrade gives max charge shots on successful parry. Thus, the shield and ball became my go-to combo for dealing with very aggressive, tanky melee enemies. Even some of the old favorites like the shotguns or plasma rifles now have new personalities with up to 4 mods allowing for a greater build variety and flexibility. In a sense, the Dark Ages feels a bit more like an RPG with some tough choices having to be made when it comes to weapon upgrades. I say tough simply because all weapons offer tempting advantages, and even after a full playthrough, I still had a good number of unupgraded weapons. And yes, I did explore extensively and uncover many of the secrets and upgrade materials. One weapon I came around to relatively late was the second Skull Crusher weapon, the Ravager. Once fully upgraded, this weapon allows you to steal life and ammo at max fire rate. This came in quite handy in some of the later arenas and boss fights where I could bring myself back from the brink of death with this weapon and the fully upgraded starting shotgun, which is now your most reliable armor generator. The Skull Crusher also just looks and sounds metal as hell, as do many other aspects of this game. Something to note about weapon mods is that you no longer have to find them in the world. They are now unlocked at specific upgrade nodes, and both options are immediately available once the node is active. You can switch between mods only in the dossier menu, and I think this is partly for balance, but also some weapons have 4 mods, meaning you would need 2 additional keys to mod your weapon mid-combat. Upgrades can be purchased at Sentinel Shrines with gold, rubies, and wraith stones, which generally have to be tracked down in secret areas. And speaking of hidden resources, I also want to give a quick shout out to the new Life Sigil system. I think it's an improvement on Eternal in 2 ways. 1, you can only carry a maximum of 3 at a time, and 2, when you die, the game asks if you wish to use the Life Sigil rather than automatically consume one. I remember using up all of my Life Sigils in Eternal on the Gladiator fight on my first attempt because I was still learning his patterns. I would have much preferred to save them for later when I had figured out the boss's patterns and it was mostly just execution holding me back. I did find one small thing that consistently bugged me about the weapons. It's the fact that you lose your powered up shot when switching to another weapon. I don't know if this is a glitch or intended feature, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that your powered up shot can basically wait forever to be fired, but then instantly disappears if you briefly need to switch to another weapon. I agree it's not a big deal, but I also think it needlessly disrupts your flow and somewhat limits your expression in combat. And speaking of switching weapons, I think there's a bit of a misconception that you don't need to do it in the Dark Ages, or that you might even be discouraged from it. In my experience, you do need to wisely select your weapons for the job, but it's not something you will need to do in a fraction of a second. You also have to be smarter about when you do it, as switching weapons is slower and can leave you vulnerable. This, in my opinion, actually raises the skill ceiling. Quick switching is officially done, although it does still seem possible if you chain weapon switches immediately after a shield charge. Whether this is a glitch or a feature that's here to stay remains to be seen. In short, however, mid-fight weapon selection is still something you very much need to consider, but requires more thought and commitment than in Eternal. I do have one more nitpick about the weapons and gear. I wish the dossier showed you some actual damage values for your weapons and shield to help you compare your choices of upgrades and runes. Take the shield, for example. It has 4 mutually exclusive upgrade paths. 2 of them focus primarily on doing damage and 2 more on crowd control and resource generation. I'm not sure which one does more damage and in what form. I don't know which form of crowd control is preferable in what situation. Now, I know part of the fun is field testing this stuff and figuring it out on your own, but I think some damage numbers in the ability or item descriptions would offer some transparency and help you create better synergies. And what fun would these weapons and abilities be without a lineup of uniquely dangerous enemies to contend with? There is a somewhat taller hierarchy in the Dark Ages, with fodder enemies at the very bottom being generally very numerous, very slow moving, and mostly serving as resource piñatas and targets for quick relocation via the shield charge. Then there are what I'd call light targets like imps and soldiers who go down just as easily but are more mobile and can also dish out some hurt if you play carelessly around their projectiles or ignore them too long. Soldiers can have either metal or energy shields, and each of these requires a different approach to dispatch, and doing so offers different payoffs. Medium enemies like Imp Stalkers and Pinkies are where you start seeing the need for parrying Hell Surge attacks and comboing abilities efficiently. Then there are Heavies and Super Heavies who are much tankier and have a variety of tricky evasive maneuvers, defensive abilities, and pressure tactics. Some are very dangerous up close, whereas others are practically impossible to kill at a distance. Some of them have multiple armor plates that will first need to be overheated and destroyed before you can start damaging their bodies. A few of them also have weapons that can be disabled via glory strikes. There is a lot of variety to keep you on your toes, and like I said earlier when discussing parrying, a large part of the fun and engagement is in learning and adapting to your enemy's strengths and weaknesses. The monsters can also be a type of leader regardless of weight class. Some leaders provide buffs to their allies, and it's often best to kill them first, as buffed enemies are significantly tankier and more aggressive. In such encounters, you are heavily incentivized to cut straight through the horde in order to kill the buff-providing leader as soon as possible. On the flip side, there are leaders who are protected by their armies with a morale aura, and in this case you need to first take out enough of their army to make them vulnerable to damage. There are also stronger mini-boss variants of enemies that drop permanent upgrades to your health, armor, or ammo when defeated. It's a lot to take in at once, but the game, in my opinion, has really smooth pacing in introducing new enemies and tools for dealing with them. The boss fights, while not many, are also of a high quality and come with some unique twists to the melee and ranged exchanges. They have multiple phases and generally provide more of a parrying and bullet hell challenge than any regular enemy, and they are overall a much greater spectacle. I also just love how the level design allows you to begin the larger encounters by surveying the battlefield from high ground. It feels epic and badass, and it subtly reminds you you are an ancient warlord with centuries of experience in dealing with the horde. It is also relevant to your gameplay. You take note of the demon formations and the positions of the leaders, you prioritize your targets, identify the location of resources, and plan your general approach. And then you dive in. In my last video or two, I complained about FPS moving away from this style of planned encounters in favor of gradually spawning monsters into an arena. And yes, the Dark Ages still has some of that, but to a much lesser extent. By and large, the most difficult encounters allow you to see what you are getting yourself into. As I've already hinted at, the levels are larger and more detailed, which is an achievement in and of itself. Many of these vast open battlefields have several main and side objectives that can be tackled in any order. There are also numerous secret areas and optional dungeons of sorts that are often interconnected and nested within each other, making exploration more of an engaging, immersive experience. The levels are also masterfully laid out so as to minimize backtracking and subtly loop you back to your main objective or guide you with crumb trails of resources such as gold or armor shards. Visually, it all feels a lot more thematically focused and fleshed out while still providing great variety and some truly imaginative locations that feel a lot less like levels or arenas and more like an actual world. And yet it's all still very enjoyable to traverse, solve puzzles, and fight in. I know I might be in the minority here, but I love the dragon sections. Granted, a huge part of this is because I just love the design and lore of the dragon. Also, there are many cool little interactions between him and the Slayer that serve as a means of indirect characterization for both of them. Lastly, once I saw what parts he had to play in the plot, it became impossible not to love him. Now, clearly these sections are not as mechanically complex as the core gameplay, but they still emphasize timing and positioning of dodges, and the wide open levels in which you fly around are breathtaking in their beauty and scale. It also allowed the developers to make this whole epic journey involving alternate dimensions and towering titans make sense and feel more connected. At the very least, I don't think they overstay their welcome at all. And it's the same with the Atlan's. They are fun and good enough for what they are mechanically, and they do not take that much time. As a narrative device, I would say they are fantastic, especially towards the end. And speaking of the narrative, I have been itching to find someone to talk to about the story. I got absolutely giddy with some of the twists and turns that take place in the last third part of the game. I don't want to spoil anything, but I also don't want to gloss over the story as if it were a side note to the action. It absolutely is not, and the presentation and overall production value are at an all-time high. The story provides a wealth of interesting details about the world of Argent D'Nur, the Sentinels, the Makers, the Wraiths, and of course the Slayer himself, as well as a few other characters I won't spoil. Each boss fight is grimly satisfying, and their designs and dialogue contribute to your drive to keep pushing on. The new villains are interesting in their motivations, visual design, and the voice acting itself is all around stellar. Something interesting that I found is there are actually quite a few similarities to the latest Dune movies, particularly the first one, both in the look and feel of certain shots and camera angles, the design of the spaceships and technology, but mainly in the role certain characters play in the plot, especially among the villains and collaborators, let's say. Again, I won't go deep into spoilers, but you guys tell me who Creed Maker reminds you of in looks, character, and political motivation. What about the witch who advises Prince Azrak? But back to the plot of The Dark Ages. It got me fired up to kick ass, and I have to say the developers handled especially well the climax and resolution of the story. A lot of games tend to either end too abruptly or overly extend their finale with fake-out climaxes and side-note conflicts that we no longer care about as we approach triumph. I'm looking at you, Uncharted 4. The Dark Ages has hit a sweet spot in its last acts, with the motivation to keep playing only ramping up further and further as you approach the end. The last few scenes really bring some greater context to the story of Doom in general, and even tie in to Doom Eternal, which brought a warm feeling of familiarity to my heart. Interestingly, I saw Dan Abnett, the famous Warhammer 40k novelist, credited for helping with the story, which in retrospect makes perfect sense considering the vibes and high quality of the writing overall. If you watched this far, then thank you, and I hope I was able to help you understand why I've enjoyed my time with the Dark Ages. Perhaps I could even persuade you to give it a try. I've been looking for a way to encapsulate my experience in a sentence or two, but I think I've made it pretty clear that I love so many things about the game. I am planning on replaying it on Nightmare, and so I hope I'll be able to put out a few more videos diving deeper into specific aspects. Doom: The Dark Ages is, in my opinion, an insanely brave and successful redesign of the formula. It is one that is very particularly suited to my tastes in its mechanics, aesthetics, sound design, character, setting, and story. Some people might be skeptical about the changes or unhappy because it's not Eternal 2. If that's the case, then I encourage you to keep playing what you love. And when you are ready for a change, the Dark Ages will be waiting for you.
Yes.